This morning, I want to talk about the highs and the lows of life, the peaks and the valleys. We all have them, and it seems the more life that we live, the more that these highs and lows become relative to one another, right? Like what once was the lowest low in our life may not be anymore compared to something else that's happened to us. Think about how you felt when you were a teenager, perhaps, and experienced your first breakup. It was devastating, and the world crumbled around you. You live a little bit of life, and you realize that it's going to be okay, that there are more relationships after that. And perhaps that no longer is your lowest low. Or think about your highest high. Maybe you graduate or go to graduate school. Maybe you get a promotion at work, and that's the highlight of your life until you have your first child. And then you realize, wow, that's a high I didn't even know how to comprehend or conceive of. Or maybe what was a low, like maybe a relationship breakup or a divorce, ends up being a high when you realize that you had kind of lost yourself in that relationship, and that by being out of that, you're discovering new parts about yourself that you love and that speak to really who you are. Or maybe even you have a low because you don't get into the school you want to go to, you don't get the job you want, and you realize a few months later that you do get a different job that perhaps is even a better fit. We all have these moments, right? These highs and these lows. They're always more easily understood in retrospect. I think, though, that we're better off when we don't compare our highs and our lows with one another, but when we just experience them. Because that is life. That's the ebb and flow of these things. And actually, we come to realize that as we live, that we really need both of these in our lives. We need the highs and the lows, right, to be a well-rounded person, to learn. And the highs and the lows, as ironic as it seems, are what help make us an even-keeled person. Now, the highs of life are much better lived together, right? In community, when you have them to share with one another. And the lows of life, I think, are only endured together in community. This is certainly evident in today's text. On this very literal mountaintop, Jesus is not alone. Now, given what we know from Luke 9, just days before this, Jesus was contemplating his death and trying to explain it to his disciples. And so it's not far-fetched to think that in this moment, he is pretty low emotionally, or at least depleted and fatigued. And it's right before today's passage that we hear Jesus describe how he will die. And we hear him say to his disciples, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it. That's tough stuff, right? This is heavy stuff, confusing stuff. And so it's clear that in these 8 days prior to today's text, Jesus was probably feeling the weight of his impending death and the weight of ensuring that his disciples understood what was required of them as well. You know, when we're down, it's always good to remember to look up. And I think that's what Jesus is doing in this passage. He actually literally heads up to a mountaintop. Now remember in the Bible that mountaintops are pretty much equivalent with an encounter with God, right? Encounters with God happen at the tops of these mountains, and probably the most well-known of these is in the Old Testament when Moses is up on Mount Sinai and he has this meeting with God, receives the 10 Commandments that become the foundation of the covenant. And Moses doesn't actually see the face of God, but when Moses is coming down the mountain, his face is shining, so much so that it scares his brother Aaron and those who are around him. I'm not sure that Moses even comprehended everything that he had experienced, but his face revealed that he had experienced something extraordinary. Sometimes I think our highs are like that, right? We can't quite put them into words, but maybe we're just walking around with a smile on our face, kind of seeing the world through rose-colored glasses. We're sort of floating through the day because of some good news we received, and we feel like we can handle anything, right, in those moments. Of course, it eventually fades at some point. In this case, Jesus goes up to the mountain to pray because I think he wants to encounter God. He needs one of these experiences. And in fact, he does encounter God in a unique way. What he encounters is actually two different figures who are symbolic of the faithfulness of God in the past, Moses and Elijah, representatives of the law and the prophets, that which Jesus has now come to fulfill. One of my favorite parts of this text is that Moses and Elijah and Jesus are all talking with one another, and we're told that they're talking about Jesus' departure. You see, these guys are here for Jesus as listening ears, as two people who can understand what he's thinking, what he's going through, where his disciples really can't understand, can they? This made me think of a reality TV show that I indulge in and watch called The Bachelor. Anybody else watch The Bachelor? Yeah, you're making your pastor really embarrassed right now. If you've ever watched that show, you'll know that at times the producer, the host, Chris Harrison, will bring on like a former bachelor or bachelorette onto the show to give advice to the current bachelor, because really, who else could understand what it's like to date 25 people at once except someone who has been through that? It's a unique life situation. This is how I imagine this moment, is that Moses and Elijah are here talking with Jesus about this unique life situation that most people can't relate to. Because if you remember, Moses and Elijah kind of had weird deaths and disappearances too. Moses was up on Mount Nebo and he could see the promised land, but was not allowed to enter the promised land. And Elijah was taken up in this fiery whirlwind into heaven. We're not really sure if he died at all. Even more, these two men both knew their successors. So Moses knew that Joshua was following him. Moses had laid his hands on him, and the people had accepted Joshua as the next leader. And Elijah, we know, passed his mantle down to Elisha. The text says in 2 Kings, the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. And the people came to meet him and bowed down to the ground before him. In this moment, I imagine that Jesus is thinking about his own successor, right? Who is going to follow and carry out the ministry that he has started? And I'm sure it's not lost on him that he knows the people who are supposed to be his successors, the people who are supposed to be following in his footsteps, are darn near asleep on that mountaintop with him. He must have been wondering about the effectiveness of his ministry, his longevity. Probably in the same way that we can get caught up in worrying about whether or not the institutional church will survive, right? Now, I find it striking that Jesus chose to take Peter, James, and John up the mountain with him. He could have gone by himself. I think perhaps he realized that the end was near, that he had much to teach them. He needed every moment with them that he could get. He also probably realized that some things you can only learn from experience, right? So they have this amazing encounter, and Jesus is glowing. And Peter, of course, wants to savor this experience and build a dwelling for Moses and Elijah so that they can all stay on the mountaintop, this high experience together. I think it's the Bible Times equivalent of Peter pulling out a selfie stick and saying, quick, everybody get together, let's get in this photo so that I can put it on Instagram or Facebook and show everybody in the world that I was with Moses and Elijah and Jesus. And of course, we all know that anything on Facebook lasts forever. It's immortal. He wants to keep this moment preserved. And who doesn't want to do this with the high moments in our life, right? Whether it's a graduation or a wedding or a birth or getting an award or hitting the game-winning shot, or maybe singing an encore after a standing ovation. Maybe even standing at the top of a 14er that you've hiked, feeling proud that you've done this. I mean, we want those highs to last a long time. But it's never long enough, is it? They seem to be gone in a flash. Which is really weird, because doesn't it seem like the lows can't be gone quick enough? That they always seem to last forever? The highs are gone quickly and the lows stay? I don't know why this is. Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that I think our highs, they tend to re-energize us, right? It's like plugging into the wall, getting a surge of energy. I'm not sure that they always teach us something new about ourselves or about the world as much as they affirm or reaffirm what we already love about ourselves or what we already know to be true about the world or God, right? The highs feed our passions because they almost always happen while we're doing things that we're already passionate about or while we're with people that we already love and are passionate about. So it doesn't take much for us to be charged up by them. On the flip side, I don't know about you, but a lot of times my lows tend to happen when I'm not with people that I'm charged up about or passionate about, and when I'm not in a circumstance that I'm passionate about, when I'm suffering physically or going through emotional or mental crisis or anything that's challenging. And I think they last a long time because it's in our lows that we really learn things about ourselves and life, right? And when we learn things about ourselves, it takes time. Change is hard. Learning is hard. So I have this thought that because we're so humbled in those low times, that's why they seem to last a long time, because we have a lot to learn. In any case, Peter's reaction is relatable, right? He wants that high to last. Of course, a cloud moves in, as clouds do, whether you're talking about mountains in the Bible or whether you're talking about, hiking in the afternoon in Colorado. The clouds eventually move in, and they obscure things. And the voice in this cloud tells the disciples not just to see Jesus, right, which would have been normal to do because Jesus is dazzling before them. It's impossible not to see him. The voice says to listen to him. To listen to all that Jesus has said and all that Jesus will say. And that's a lot harder, right? It's a lot harder to listen to what Jesus has been saying than to just see him dazzling before them. And so everyone just stays quiet. Did you catch that part of the text? No one talks about it. It's kind of an odd thing to have this wonderful experience on top of a mountain and not talk about it. But the more I thought about it, I thought, well, gosh, we do that a lot, right? We see the ways that God is working in our lives or in the world, and sometimes we're reticent to share that with folks because we're afraid it's not PC, or that we'll be seen as a religious fanatic, or that people will change the way they talk or act around us. I experienced this just on Friday night at a neighborhood gathering when somebody asked what I do, and I said I was a pastor. What kind of pastor? A Baptist pastor. Oh, that changed the tone of the conversation. The truth is, though, isn't spreading the good news of God all about telling about the magical, mysterious ways we see God at work in the world? Isn't that the point? Because there's so much, quote unquote, evidence in the world that people point to say that God doesn't exist. They point to the tragedies and the destruction, to violence, to war, to corrupt leadership inside and outside of the church. So shouldn't we then be talking about all the evidence we can point to show people how God is at work in the world? Whether it's a mountaintop high happening to us or someone we know, we must be a part of the transforming work of Christ in the world. We have to talk about it. We can't be silent bystanders. The world needs our voices. God needs our witness. And this is where the second half of this text comes in. Yes, when Jesus was down, he looked up and literally went up to the mountain. It's also true, though, that what goes up must come down. This is the reality of gravity. which is literally defined as the natural phenomenon by which all things with mass or energy are brought together or gravitate toward one another. Gravity is the force by which a planet or another body draws objects toward its center. Isn't that a beautiful image? It's very grounding and cohesive and centralizing. Gravity brings things toward one another. It's a force that draws us toward the center. So whether they want to come down from this mountaintop experience or not, Jesus, Peter, John, and James had to come down. They were drawn down, and not just down from the mountain. They were drawn back into the community itself, back into the center of life. And they were met by a crowd. And in this moment, Peter, John, and James, and all of the disciples were reminded of their center, of their purpose, of their mission, of their calling, which was to help others, right? To be there for others. Not to experience the joy of Jesus on their own atop a mountain, but to share Jesus' love and joy with others. And they're reminded about this because Jesus heals a young boy who is seizing, who is possessed. We're not sure the exact circumstances. What we do know is that he was suffering. It was a boy whose dad says that the disciples didn't help because they thought they couldn't. Now, a couple weeks ago, we read a passage about Jesus getting angry and turning over the tables in the temple. This is another place where we see Jesus lose it a bit, don't we? He says, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you?" This is not the Jesus who says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and are bearing heavy burdens, and I will give you rest," right? This is not the Jesus in John 14 who says, "I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go, then that there where I am, I will come again, take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also." No, this is Jesus saying, "How much longer do I have to be with you? And how much longer do I have to bear or put up with you?" He's frustrated. In Greek, the word for perverse is diastropho, which actually means to distort, to misinterpret. And the word for faithless, apistos, means without trust. So another way of saying this would be, do you not trust what I have said? Have you distorted or misinterpreted what I've been teaching you all along? You can do this. You can help others. It's not just me who can heal. Stop distorting God's power. You have that power too. When Jesus heals this boy, Luke writes that everyone was astounded at the greatness of God, and they were all talking about it. And the verse right after the passage we read says that everyone is amazed, talking about what Jesus had done. And in that moment, Jesus says to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands." Another way to put this is, stop listening to how everyone is talking about how amazing I am, because I'm going to be gone soon. Soon, you will have to be the amazing ones. As we wrap up our spiritual practices season of passion and humility, we couldn't have a more poignant text. We see the passion of the disciples and their love and awe of Jesus, Moses, and Elijah as they plead to stay on that mountaintop forever. And we see the humility they experience when they realize they have to come down the mountain and go back into the community. Jesus himself shows us that to have passion for the gospel is to not merely bask in the glory of God, but to humble oneself in service and love for others. And also to humble oneself when we know we need a break and need to draw up to that mountaintop. Passion and humility can't be separated from each other in the spiritual life. And we need those mountaintop experiences, those times when our passions are reignited. The reality is, though, for most of us, we live in this nitty-gritty reality of the day-to-day, and in the midst of that nitty-gritty reality of the day-to-day, we have lows. And in those lows, we are humbled. And we're not alone in this. I really don't see any disciples in the Bible who had a peachy life, right? They had a lot of lows too. Now, I think this can come to feel imbalanced for us because we want to have more highs in our life than lows, right? We want our life to be, quote unquote, easy or at least bearable. But God doesn't promise that the good life is going to be the easy life. God doesn't promise us that the good life is going to be this mountaintop experience where God's reality is made so crystal clear to us, where it's dazzling. What's more likely the case is that faith will be made real to us down in the community when we're with one another, struggling and living together, helping and healing, right? When we are the agents of help and healing in the world. What if Jesus' transfiguration is about God's glory being revealed on a mountaintop and about God's glory being revealed through how we see and listen to the pain of others and how we respond? Think about it. What would be the point of Jesus' ministry for 3 years if he came and he did all these great things and then he died and left and all of those things just stopped? Does that glorify God? Or is it that God's glory is revealed in us? We see it in the book of Acts. Do we see it in the pages of our life? The best part about all the highs and lows in this text, I think, is when a father and a son, who are in probably one of the lowest moments of their life, receive this high of healing from Jesus. It's a reminder of the power of love, the power of presence. God is here with us, up, down, and all around, right? We're not meant to just live up here. We're not meant to just live down here. We're meant to live here with one another so that we can go up and down together. As we make our way to Lent, we're going to see that the very passion of Christ is a journey of immense humility. And without Jesus' humility, we don't get this week of passion. And without his week of passion, we don't get the resurrection, the high of all highs that puts everything else in perspective. Amen.